Hello. Agapanthus, lily of the Nile. A plant that we're all familiar with. It produces those lovely big round blooms during the summertime. There's an example of an old bloom that's died back. And here are some other blooms which I've retained. I've cut all the others off, but I've retained these because I want to gather the seed, and indeed I can see that the seed has fallen off inside this horticultural fleece. And I'll be sowing those in the spring. I've already gathered a lot of seeds and sown a seed tray full in this cold frame here behind me. Anyway, Agapanthus Winter Care, Agapanthus Winter Protection, and are Agapanthus hardy in the UK? I suppose those are the three questions I'm answering in this video. Now, I've had Agapanthus for many years, over a decade, and I had a lovely collection, 15 probably, bigger than these. Beautiful, big, I think they call them globe masters. Wonderful plants, and they were a source of great pleasure and quite a lot of pride because they used to sit at the front of the cottage and people could see them as they walked past. However, last winter I had a complete Agapanthus disaster. I lost every single one of them. I know what happened, and I'll tell you in a minute. These are all replacements. There's 4 here. These are beautiful white Agapanthus, which I put in what I now call my white garden at the front of the cottage. And this is a lovely blue one that the people that used to live in the cottage brought when they visited, because they know I like Agapanthus. So again, that's got special feelings with it. I want to protect it. I can see actually there's probably about 3 in there. I will divide that in the springtime. Agapanthus like to be cozy in the pots. You can see this one is cozy because it's got lovely roots coming out of the bottom there. You can also see that those roots are quite chunky and fat and a good store of water. They do like to be cozy, but they don't like to be completely pot bound. So there does come a stage when you do have to repot them. Talk about that in another video. Let's talk about winter protection and UK hardiness. I want to divide my sort of thinking into 4 squares, if you like. Apologies if you can hear background noise. My neighbour on that side is putting a new drive in. They've got a JCB in, and my neighbour on that side is having a kids club today. So there's children that side and a JCB that side. But time waits for no man, and I've got to get on with this job today. So, winter protection. Divide it up into 4 squares. 2 of the squares are evergreen Agapanthus and non-evergreen or deciduous. And the other 2 are planted in the ground or planted in pots. And you've got 4 different combinations of all of the above, if you like. So you could have an evergreen one in the ground, or an evergreen one in a tub, or you could have a deciduous one in the ground or a deciduous one in a tub. So I'll kind of cover how to care for them over the winter. This is based on my experience and my bitter experience last year, actually. So let's talk about whether they're evergreen or deciduous. The evergreen ones, which all these are evergreen here that you see in front of you, have slightly chunkier, thicker leaves. A bit more like a succulent, if you like. And that's how you can identify them. You can also identify them because they keep the leaves over winter, which is pretty obvious. The point to remember about the evergreen ones is they are less hardy than the ones that lose their leaves. So just remember that for now. The ones that lose their leaves have slightly spikier leaves, and they do die back in the winter, so all you'll end up with is like a pot full of dead grass. But they're slightly more hardy. So, what's the problem for Agapanthus in the winter? It's a combination of 2 things. Number 1, cold. Number 2, wet. That's what I did wrong last year. 2 things. I got cocky, I got complacent, and the other thing was I took someone else's advice, so I failed to take responsibility for my own Agapanthus. And I left them outside here in the compound. And last winter we had a very, very severe, prolonged, sustained frost, where the temperature suddenly went from +10 centigrade to -7 centigrade, and then it stayed low for a few weeks. And it was wet, and all the pots were outside where they'd been rained on, so they were sodden. So they completely froze, and they were frozen for over a week, and it just killed them all. So I lost all my beautiful collection of Agapanthus. It's not going to happen again. So You know now the difference between evergreen and deciduous. I would treat those in pots exactly the same. And that's what I'm going to do with these in pots this year. It's now the middle of November. We've not had a frost yet, but frost is just around the corner. I am going to move these to the garage. I can do because they're in pots, so I'm going to move them to the garage. If they were deciduous ones in pots that had lost the leaves, I would also move them to the garage. The garage is frost free and dry. You can see they've got a store of water. They don't need watering over the winter. I'll keep my eye on them, but unless they go completely dry, I won't water them. I'll just leave them in the garage. They will have some dampness in this compost already because they've been sitting outside here and it's been raining for a week, so they will be wet through. So they'll probably over the course of the winter dry out, and then they'll start using the reserves of water. I'll keep my eye on them just in case. If it gets incredibly dry, which it won't, I might splash a bit of water on them, but I probably won't. I'll just put them in the garage. And I will do exactly the same if I had deciduous ones. Even if they were the deciduous ones, which we know are more hardy, I would also now move them to the garage, frost free, and let them dry out. And then in the spring, I'll bring them out. I'll pardon them off and I'll bring them back out again. But what if you've planted yours in the ground? Well, wind it back a stage. If you're going to plant these in the ground, ideally you would have already planted them into very well-drained soil. And you might have even put a little hollow of gravel underneath to ensure that the roots are not sat in water, to get that water away from the roots. So that's ideally what you will have done, a well-drained site, possibly even raised up, and hopefully in the lee of a building where it's slightly more sheltered from the more severe frost. Don't panic, because even if they're in the ground, even if they're the non-hardy ones, the evergreen ones, they are still slightly hardy, so you can get away with leaving them in the ground. But what I would do, this is what I would do personally, and there's lots of different opinions, and you really have to make your own decision. I would mulch them with a very thick layer around the plants of fresh manure, fresh horse manure. Go and find someone with a pony or a horse, or go to a local stable and just get a couple of buckets of fresh manure, not well rotted, fresh. The reason I'm saying fresh is because if it's fresh, it might still be decomposing, and if it's still decomposing, it might still be producing heat. Last week I bought one of those little oven thermometers that you stick in your food, and I took it down to my neighbour's manure pile. There's a video on it. It was fascinating. Ground temperature was 9 degrees. The manure pile was 21 degrees. So the way I think about it is, if you just put a mulch of fresh manure around the top of your Agapanthus, whether they be hardy or non-hardy, and they're in the ground, that might just provide some ambient heat throughout the winter. The next thing I would do is I would put straw on top, a mulch of straw, and that would give them a layer of insulation just to keep them from having exposure to those really, really severe frosts. And I think if you do that, you'll be safe. You'll get away with it. Now, what happens in the springtime? Well, they'll emerge, won't they? And then you can remove the straw, and the manure that's there will have rotted over the winter, and that will feed the pot, the plant, I should say. The reason I said pot is because I want to talk about this one. In the springtime, I can see that is pot bound. It's more than cosy. It's going to start struggling if it stays in there. So in the springtime, I'm going to divide that, and I'll put it there's probably 3, possibly 4 plants in there. I'll put them into new pots in very gritty compost. But the way to get flowers out of these is to have them cosy. So I won't expect any flowers off this plant for a couple of years after I've repotted it. If you propagate them from seed, you're going to get flowers after about 3 years. So that's a kind of a rule of thumb, I think. It's going to be a couple of years before I get them flowery again after I've repotted them. So there we go. Agapanthus Winter Care. Think of 2 types of plant, hardy and non-hardy. The hardy ones lose the leaves and the non-hardy ones keep the leaves. And then think about 2 situations, once in pots, once in the ground. If they're in pots, whether they're hardy or not, get them in a shed or a greenhouse or a garage where it's frost free. Stop watering them, keep an eye on them. If they're in the ground, Ideally you will have planted them in well draining soil and then give them a really good mulch of not well rotted or fresh manure, and then put some sawdust on top. That's what I would do, and that's what I wish I'd done last year. I did a video on my Agapanthus disaster, and I'll link it at the end of this one. Hope that's been useful and informative, and I'll see you soon for some more Agapanthus adventures. I'm now going to move these into the garage.